Hi, and welcome to the Jack News. This is Ron Nielsen, and this is the Jack News podcast. And I've got with me Kelly Ward. Hi, Kelly.
Morning, Ron. How are you?
Good. You ready to talk about some important issues?
Oh man, I'm still tickled but slightly confused by Tim Walz. He was on Jimmy Kimmel the other night and he was expressing his deep desire to wake up on November 6th with Madam President. Ron, I
Uh,
have questions.
that's a nice gaff. Yeah, he's a funny knucklehead guy. Let's talk about him today. That's a good idea. Let's talk about him. Okay, hold tight. How
Okay.
about we talk about him in a little bit? I was hoping maybe we could discuss some survey information.
I would love that because it is everyone's all aflutter about our swing states and who's going to win this election. We've got 24 days till vote day. So let's hear it.
So, the Jack News sponsors a tracking study that's been going on weekly. And this study is conducted by Survey Fever's Public Reports. And the study is of the targeted swing states, the seven targeted swing states for president. And then it also goes over the top eight Senate races, which are considered toss-up races. So toss-up meaning pretty darn close. And the presidential races, these tracking studies of these targeted swing states will determine who wins the election. So when we started watching what the tracking studies were showing, Trump was behind in all seven states. But now what we see is he has gained momentum, and now he's ahead in four of the seven states. And frankly, if he wins one of the three states that Kamala Harris is ahead in, I mean, we're talking about Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. If he wins one of those states, he's got the win down. He's going to be the next president. So we have, looking at these tracking, the most recent tracking results released by Jack News and Survey Fever were last Monday, and they showed Arizona up by Trump, Georgia up by Trump, Nevada up by Trump, and North Carolina up. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Harris was ahead in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So we're talking about all these races are within the margin of error. And this sample from the Jack News sponsored study is 700 interviews each week. So that gives you a margin of error about 3.7, Kelly. So it's moving in Trump's direction. I mean, Trump has some momentum here. It's been going on each week. We've seen a little bit of a slight increase, and now we're seeing Trump ahead. And I mean, this Pennsylvania is like within a point, and Wisconsin's within a point, and Michigan's within a half a point. I mean, these are really tight races.
Yeah, that's quite a story from what we were seeing 6 or 8 weeks ago, right? I mean, it seems like that's the big news is that there's momentum for a candidate, and that candidate's Donald Trump.
I wanted to mention something else about these polls. I mean, when we're talking about, the importance of Wisconsin and Michigan, they have Muslim voters, a contingency of Muslim voters. And I think that it's important to note that Jill Stein, Dr. Stein, who is the Green Party nominee, is focusing her entire campaign now on Wisconsin and Michigan. So what's the relevance of all that? Well, Stein, as a Green nominee, the Greens would, if the Green Party didn't exist, they'd be voting, really as Democrats. The Greens are a little left of the general Democratic Party. And Stein is coming in and she's campaigning primarily within the Muslim communities. And she's doing very well. She just recently got an endorsement from a group called Anti-Harris, which is a Democratic group that was voicing concern about Harris getting the nomination the way she did. So that group just endorsed Stein, and like I mentioned, she's getting some strong support within the Muslim community in these areas. Now, I mean, we're talking about kind of fractions of a percentage, or maybe a point, or maybe a little bit more than a point. I mean, it's really small numbers in the big scheme of things, but when you're talking about a race that is so significantly tight, uh, this is a big deal. And Stein is basically throwing a dagger in the Democratic Party, stating that she wants to get noticed, she wants the Greens noticed, and she wants their causes noticed, and she's going to go in there and maybe be a disruptor, and maybe change the outcome of the entire election. So that's something we're not seeing a lot of in the press, but it's extremely important. And I think that kind of falls into something else, Kelly, and that was this discussion about whether or not people even notice the third parties.
Right. And this is really a long-term strategy that's, I mean, quite remarkable that they're pursuing this, given what I think is at stake, or at least what the Democrats have said is at stake for the country. Stein is looking at this, and the Green Party is looking at this in a over quite a number of years to really have the impact that they want to have on the Democratic Party. The myopic focus of a single election and a single issue group of folks, because this is oriented towards foreign policy, right? Uh, I mean, again, I think it's remarkable that she's willing to push this all the way to election day in what the Democrats have cast as a historic election. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think the third party candidates are always fighting for relevance. I mean, that's their main issue. I want to be relevant. I have a voice. I want to be heard, and they're and they're always fighting. The fight of not having money, not having media attention. So if somehow they can force themselves into a position, I mean, we're just talking about the Greens right now. If she can force herself into a position where she becomes relevant, that changes the game. I mean, she could go back and ask for, some kind of maybe she gets concessions within the Democratic Party in the future to somehow be noticed. I mean, the Greens, can say, hey, look, either notice us and include us in the discussion, or we're going to go continue doing what we're doing and being a disruptor.
And I guess notice in the larger scheme of things is things like what you're just pointing out, which is these third parties are typically not included when you do surveys. And so we get an underrepresentation of support, or the potential for an underrepresentation of support for a candidate. And then you're not included in the national debates that are televised. And so are those the kinds of things you're talking about in terms of we want to get noticed for elections
Well, I
in the
think that
future?
they're probably looking at relevance for their causes. The Greens have issues that they probably think are not being heard within the Democratic Party, and they want those voices heard. And that was the purpose, probably, why the Green Party was set up. Uh, I think that you're right on with pollsters. Most polls you see do not include third party candidates in the polling. We've noticed that this Jack News poll and the polls that are being conducted through Survey Fever do include third party candidates. They are mentioned in the questionnaire, and they're not released unless that particular candidate has over 3% of support. So they're not being shown in the results. If they're not shown the results, that means they're being flipped into the other category, or undecided. But the fact that they're being included in the questionnaire gives a more accurate representation of the results. If you don't include them, which I'm looking at different pollsters around the country, and it's pretty standard not to include third party candidates. If you don't include them, then you're doing what they call a forced ballot question, and you're forcing people to choose between Harris and
Mm.
Trump. And that, taking into account the Green Party, they would traditionally, if the Greens weren't there, would be voting Democratic or choosing not to vote. But if they're in a forced ballot question, they're going to choose Kamala Harris. So that gives her a false sense of support. And that means that her numbers could be inflated. We've seen this kind of problem occur in other cycles, particularly, in, I think 2012 it happened, it's 2016. And they were talking about the underrepresentation of certain candidates and the overrepresentation of certain candidates. And this is one of the causes. So we also have, Cornel West, who polls very strongly from the Democratic Party. And then we have, the Libertarian Party, whose candidate, Chase Oliver, probably is a little more split. I mean, he does pull some from Democrats, but probably the majority come from the Republican side. But not including them does, change the accuracy of the polls. So, but again, I'll mention on this Jack News poll that we are showing, where these numbers are really tight, we are showing that the third-party candidates are being included.
Yeah.
How about if we talk for just a minute about the Senate races?
Yeah, that sounds great.
The Senate races are being included. And as I mentioned, there's several what they consider toss-up races, which are races where votes are fairly tight, and if those races change hands, meaning from say Democrat to Republican, they're going to possibly change the who controls the Senate. And right now, the Republicans really need to take 2 seats, and they'll control the Senate. So Kelly, if you're looking at these numbers that we've got from the Jack News study from Survey Fever, the races in Montana and the races in West Virginia, which are currently held by Democrats, are switching. If these numbers hold out, and people can look at them themselves, they just go to the Jack News site and they can see the articles. Tim Sheehy in Montana, the Republican, is pulling ahead. So if he wins in Montana, and then Jim Justice is up by 10 points, he's been up as high as 12 or 13 points. If he pulls ahead in West Virginia, you're going to see a flip in the Senate. And the Senate majority is now going to switch over to the Republican side. So that's big news. That's big news.
That's really big news. And so there is a lot of stake in the election. And I'm continuing to be fascinated with third parties and their impact. And of course, we got Bobby Kennedy and whatnot. And at some point, we probably ought to have a decompression on what their impact was to this race. We probably don't have a lot of time right now to dig into it, but I think it's worth talking about.
Well, let's take a quick short break. We got our buddies Kelly and Jim, and let's take a break with them for a moment.
This segment of Jack News is sponsored by Canonizer.com. Build consensus in a divided world with Canonizer. I'm Kelly Cassidy, and with me as usual is my good friend Jim Bennett for today's Jack News. Today, Jim, I would like to talk about censorship in the federal government.
Okay.
The America First Legal Foundation, a conservative watchdog group, obtained a slide deck that showed on August 21st, 2021, the National Security Council held a private meeting with the United Kingdom's Counter-Disinformation Unit to discuss how to prevent disinformation in the United States, how to work with social media companies to restrict speech that the government deems as misinformation. Jim, I can think of nothing worse than for a federal government agency to actively look at other countries on how to combat information they don't like. Our country is based on the option of free speech. Let people decide what they want to believe, what they want to listen to, and if they decide that the government isn't saying what is truthful, then they should be able to seek out a different source. What do you think, Jim?
Well, Kelly, I agree with you to some degree, but I very much disagree with you to another degree. Where we have common ground here is in the idea that free speech is essential. The government should not be in the business of policing free speech, and that the federal government ought not to be involved with foreign countries in trying to police free speech. Where we disagree is in taking the America First legal foundation at face value. This is Stephen Miller's group, who is an entirely untrustworthy source. And based on my looking into this, this is more of a focus on how do we prevent disinformation, as opposed to not just speech we don't like, but categorizing and recognizing speech, particularly coming from foreign governments, such hostile governments like Russia or China, that is deliberately spreading misinformation under the false pretense of authority and credibility. I think that those are discussions worth having, and I think that that was the focus of what was going on here, and that the America First Legal Foundation is mischaracterizing the purpose for these discussions. If, however, I am wrong and these discussions result in the government trying to actively police First Amendment rights of American citizens, then I'll be happy to join your camp.
Well, thanks, Jim. I'm going to call this at least a tie. We've found some common ground. Hopefully everybody can find some common ground at canonizer.com.
Okay, we're back. Kelly, how are you again? Second discussion.
Second half of the podcast. Yes, I'm doing terrific, and I'm excited about. Normally these vice presidential candidates don't provide a lot of excitement and fodder, but I think on the Democrat side, Tim Walz is proven himself out to have accurately given himself a moniker of knucklehead. Have you been following these gaffes that he's got?
Well, I think Knucklehead's a funny name. I mean, he's a shucks type of guy, and I mean that's likable. That's a very likable persona, and he's coming from the Midwest, and that kind of fits right in. And he's kind of I don't know, down to earth, and I know you're mentioning he wants to, or he refers to himself by the moniker of Knucklehead. I mean that's funny.
But is it really appropriate, and is he adding something to the ticket? And the misstatements and gaffes, there's a difference between those two things, and then there's outright lying about your past and your history. And I think he's trying to, with the aw shucks approach, he's trying to place these, what I would call lies, in the category of a gaffe or a misstatement or a misspeak. And I don't know that we can really give him all that much grace. So what was his actual rank in the military, and why would you overinflate that? You didn't go to war, so why do you talk about carrying weapons of war into war? Tiananmen Square, clearly you were not in Tiananmen Square during the uprising and what happened there. You were in Nebraska. And then you didn't really make friends with school shooters. And okay, we can say that was a bit of a misspeak in the height of a debate, but why even have that as a distraction when clearly if you would just, put your head in the game, you wouldn't really speak in that way, So I'm curious about what you think, Ron, in terms of you've seen this stuff a lot, obviously, and is it going to be having an impact on the election?
Well, I think that like I mentioned, I think his persona is very likable. I think that he seems like someone, I mean, he looks like somebody's dad or their grandpa or their uncle or the guy that, you've known your whole life. I mean, he comes across that way. And I mean, that's positive. That's a good thing. I think when you get into, these stories, these gaffes, I mean, at first they kind of seem silly. I mean, I made friends with school shooters. I mean, that makes him look kind of a little goofy, but still kind of funny, but some of these other things are just made up stories. I mean, these are lies. I mean, he knew
Right.
what rank he was in the military when he when he left the military. He knew what his rank was. He knew he
Mhm.
wasn't in the square. I mean, he knew he wasn't there in China. He knew that didn't take place. I mean,
Right.
apparently he was
Right.
in Nebraska at the time. So those are kind of and you know, I think JD Vance has given him a pretty tough go. I mean, he's gone after him on a lot of this stuff and called him out on it. You know, I mean, when they had the debate, Waltz, you know, had to spend, you know, the first several minutes just basically apologizing for gaffes.
Right.
But I
Right.
do know, I have heard though that he is doing really well in one poll, and that was a poll of men that use public restrooms. And the poll results were that Waltz is doing extremely well with men who choose to use the stall, whereas Vance is doing really well about men who choose to use the urinal. I don't know if that
What-
has any validity, but
Well,
it is
I tell you, you pollsters will go to great lengths to get to the heart of the matter, won't you?
so. What about this story with the 60-minute thing? Um,
Boy,
have you
I've been following it a little bit, it's kind of an interesting thing. What's the obligation of an outfit like 60 Minutes to journalistic integrity? And what does that mean anymore and all that? So I think it's a legitimate debate that has been started. And of course, Trump's ramping it up to the highest level, and you get a lot of comment back and forth. What's their obligation? Just run that interview end to end with no cuts. We've been around this stuff enough to know that they've got to fit that segment into their 15-minute slot, and sometimes your answers get cut and trimmed. I mean, it's no different than a uh, print reporter who is summarizing a response that you've given, and we see how badly they can do that. But this is 60 Minutes, and it is the presidential race. And for them to have put two different versions of a response to a question by Kamala on their website, I think really sparked the debate.
well, I don't think it's unusual for media outlets to edit interviews. I think that's a fairly common thing. I mean, you know, candidates will make mistakes, and you know, any type of an interview, there's going to be mistakes, and at times, and the media wants to have a good reflection of the discussion, so they want to make sure that people are presented in the proper light. So I think, you know, doing an edit here and there is kind of normal procedure, and I think that's accepted policy. Um, I think under this condition, you know, she gave a complete word salad response, and you know, that became a public document. I mean, it was released into the public array and the forum, and she messed up. So they went
Mhm.
back and did a major fix. You know, they provided a completely different response. Um, you know, I mean, if they were a little more dealing with this, they should have fixed it before they released anything. But the fact is that her response initially was a word salad, and their fix was completely something different. Um, I mean, you know, that's kind of of an odd discussion. I mean, I guess that she also had a town hall the other day, and what's this deal? I mean, you can probably explain a little bit better about this. She kind of takes on these accents or something like that of the population
Right.
she's talking with. I mean, I saw one a while ago where she was talking to an African American crowd, and she took on some kind of a cultural, folksy African American accent and changed her whole demeanor and the way she was talking and the presentation, and then what happened the other night?
Yeah, so she's at Univision Town Hall, and she adopts a Hispanic or Latina affectation to her voice as she's speaking to that particular crowd. And what do you call that, Ron? A
That's a
shapeshifter?
shapeshifter. She's a chameleon.
A chameleon. I love it. What a great. Okay, well, we've coined a new term now. She's a
She's a
chameleon.
chameleon. She can become Hispanic. She can become. She's a Latina. She now can become, someone who speaks in a cultural Black accent. I mean, whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, we had to
I,
invite her to Mormon land here in Utah and see how she starts talking and green jello and I don't know.
that's funny.
But
Well,
anyway, Kelly, that's probably it for today. That's all we can probably go through in one deal today. So thank you
we'd
very
sure
much.
like to invite everybody to go to jacknews.net for the latest Jack News Survey Fever public reports on the presidential and senatorial tracking polls, and for other news related to the election.
All right. Thank you.
Take care, Ron.